stop dreaming. That's where most new crypto investors get stuck. They see XRP sitting around $2 and think, if banks are really using this, why isn't it $100 yet? Imagine yourself scrolling through your phone one morning, coffee in hand, and you see a tweet claiming that XRP could someday cost as much as a full vacation in Bali. $100, $500, even $1,000. It sounds wild enough to laugh, but here at BullionIQ, we don't just laugh, we analyze. We dig into the numbers, the technology, and the adoption stories to separate hype from reality. So welcome back to BullionIQ, the channel where we break crypto news, trends, and analysis into simple, actionable insights. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe, because today we're going to unpack the XRP hype and see what's really possible for this token. So let's start with the obvious. XRP today is hovering around $2.20. That's after a strong year, up hundreds of percent from last year, but $2 is still a long way from the $100 entry-level price prediction circulating on social media. People like Barry C. claim that when banks fully adopt XRP, prices will soar into 4 digits. It's a catchy idea. Everyone wants a rocket ship crypto story. But excitement is not strategy. Here at BullionIQ, we always focus on understanding the mechanics behind the numbers, because hype alone does not make a token valuable. The logic seems simple. Banks adopt XRP for cross-border payments, liquidity demand rises, price shoots up. On the surface, it's seductive. But reality is rarely that simple. Ripple, the company behind XRP, has built a sophisticated product suite, including RippleNet for messaging and ODL for on-demand liquidity. ODL is the only segment that strictly requires XRP. In theory, if every global bank flipped the ODL switch, XRP demand would skyrocket. But in practice, banks are cautious. They experiment with central bank digital currencies, private ledgers, or even move dollars across RippleNet without touching XRP at all. Some institutions like SBI Japan and Tranglo use parts of Ripple's stack, yet XRP's price hasn't exploded. That's because technology adoption does not equal token adoption. You could have trillions of dollars flowing through RippleNet tomorrow, and if it mostly stays in fiat or stablecoins, XRP might barely move. This is where the emotional side of crypto enters. Markets run not just on math, but on belief, fear of missing out, and community sentiment. We've seen it with Bitcoin and Dogecoin. People chase stories, narratives, and hype cycles. So when someone claims XRP can reach $500 or $1,000, your brain immediately asks, what if? That what if is powerful but dangerous. Without analyzing the fundamentals, it's easy to overestimate the probability of extreme outcomes. This is why breaking down XRP's real-world adoption, liquidity, and regulatory hurdles is crucial. Right now, the hype around XRP serves as motivation more than a prediction. It gets retail investors excited, prompts discussions, and sparks debates. But long-term success depends on utility. Ripple's products like ODL offer speed, efficiency, and near-zero transaction fees, which can save banks millions. Early adopters, like SBI, are already benefiting. Yet a handful of banks does not guarantee a price explosion to 4-digit territory. Regulation remains an ever-present factor. Even after Ripple's legal victories, banks want predictable rules, not surprises. Stablecoins and CBDCs are growing alternatives, offering predictable adoption paths for risk-averse institutions. So here's where we stand for retail investors. Take these hype-driven predictions as a motivational poster on your wall. They remind you to research, stay informed, and manage expectations. Don't let a single tweet dictate your financial strategy. Instead, focus on understanding Ripple's technology, the role of XRP in liquidity, and the market dynamics that influence token prices. Prices move on sentiment, yes, but true value comes from utility and adoption. Be cautious, stay disciplined, and control your strategy. Hodl if it aligns with your plan, or adjust your position if the fundamentals don't support the hype. At the end of the day, XRP could see significant growth if banks adopt it on a large scale, but reaching $100, $500, or $1,000 per coin is not as simple as turning on a switch. Real adoption, liquidity math, regulatory clarity, and market sentiment all play a role. That's why we dig deeper here on BullionIQ, so you can separate dreams from reality and make informed decisions. Stick around because in Part 2, we'll explore XRP's liquidity mechanics, how banks interact with the token, and what realistic price targets look like based on current adoption trends. It's time to dive into XRP's price mechanics and liquidity, the part that often confuses retail investors. Many people assume that when banks start using RippleNet, XRP will automatically shoot to hundreds or thousands of dollars. That's not how it works. The token's value depends on how much XRP is actually needed for transactions and how much supply is available to meet that demand. Right now, the total XRP supply is fixed at 100 billion coins, but a large portion is held by Ripple itself, and not all of it is in circulation. Even if a few banks suddenly start using XRP for liquidity, the overall market might not feel the impact immediately because the amount needed for settlement is relatively small compared to the total supply. Let's break this down. Ripple's on-demand liquidity system allows banks to convert one currency to XRP, move it across borders, and then convert it back into another fiat currency. In theory, this could create massive demand for XRP, but in practice, banks are cautious. They prefer to test the system, run small pilot programs, and often use stablecoins or fiat rails to minimize exposure. This is why the XRP price can stay low, even when the technology is being actively adopted. For a price surge to happen, the volume of XRP used in actual transactions has to be large enough to create scarcity. Right now, the liquidity math doesn't support a sudden 4-digit price tag. Exponential growth in liquidity would be needed for XRP to hit the hype numbers. For example, if a global bank consortium starts moving billions of dollars daily through XRP, prices would start reacting. But until then, retail investors buying based on social media predictions are essentially betting on speculation, not adoption. That's why understanding the difference between RippleNet adoption and XRP token adoption is critical. A bank can use Ripple's messaging or settlement technology without touching the token, which means the XRP price may barely budge, despite increasing usage of the platform. Another important factor is market depth. Even if banks start accumulating XRP, the market needs enough liquidity to absorb large purchases without causing extreme volatility. If a few whales or institutions try to buy massive amounts in a shallow market, the price can spike temporarily, but these spikes are often short-lived. Long-term growth depends on sustainable demand, where daily transaction volumes support higher price levels without sudden crashes. Right now, XRP's market depth is strong enough for normal trading, but would need significant expansion to handle trillions of dollars flowing consistently. Sentiment also plays a huge role. In crypto, hype cycles act as fuel. When people believe in a story, prices can rise faster than fundamentals justify. We've seen this repeatedly. Bitcoin, Dogecoin, and other tokens have surged simply because communities, influencers, or media narratives convince the masses that this is the next big thing. XRP is no different. Optimism, fear of missing out, and narrative momentum can temporarily push prices higher, but they cannot replace real adoption and liquidity. This is why extreme predictions like $500 or $1,000 are so rare. They require both exponential demand and sustained market confidence. Regulatory clarity also influences liquidity and adoption. Ripple's legal victory with the SEC removed a significant roadblock, but banks still want predictable rules. Large institutions are highly risk-averse. They won't push trillions of dollars through XRP unless they have legal certainty. Stablecoins and central bank digital currencies provide safer alternatives with clear frameworks, meaning banks have options other than XRP for liquidity solutions. This limits how quickly XRP can achieve those extreme price targets. That said, there is reason for cautious optimism. Every successful pilot, adoption announcement, or liquidity improvement adds credibility to XRP's use case. Ripple's acquisitions, like Hidden Road, and the rollout of stablecoin rails expand the infrastructure that can eventually support higher demand. But it's a gradual process. The token cannot magically jump from $2 to $1,000 without massive growth in both adoption and liquidity. For retail investors, the takeaway is clear. Understand the underlying mechanics before chasing social media hype. Focus on realistic growth, adoption trends, and market liquidity, rather than extreme speculative predictions. By examining XRP's liquidity math and adoption realities, you start to see why the hype cycle exists, but also why extreme predictions are rare. Optimism matters, but fundamentals always catch up. In Part 3, we'll analyze real bank adoption cases, explore how Ripple's technology integrates with financial institutions, and evaluate what realistic demand scenarios could look like for XRP in the next few years. Now that we understand XRP's liquidity and market mechanics, it's time to look at real-world bank adoption and how that affects realistic demand. One common misconception is that every bank using RippleNet will automatically need XRP. In reality, only the on-demand liquidity (ODL) system requires the token. Many banks can use Ripple's messaging and settlement products without ever touching XRP. That means adoption of Ripple technology does not automatically equal token price increases. Take SBI Japan, for example. They have been using parts of RippleNet for years, running pilot programs and cross-border payments, yet XRP's price hasn't shot into the hundreds. This shows that real adoption is often gradual, controlled, and carefully measured by institutions. Another example is Tranglo, which integrates Ripple's stack into their cross-border payment system. They leverage some XRP liquidity for efficiency, but only a fraction of the total token supply is used. These examples illustrate why even active bank adoption doesn't immediately translate into a dramatic price spike. The market simply isn't large enough to absorb extreme token demand yet. For XRP to reach ambitious targets like $100 or $500, adoption would need to scale exponentially, with multiple large banks simultaneously moving billions of dollars daily through the ODL system. Until then, predictions of four-digit prices remain highly speculative. It's also important to understand the scale of the numbers involved. A $100 XRP would give the token a market capitalization larger than most of the top global companies. A $500 or $1,000 XRP would rival or surpass the combined market caps of Apple, Microsoft, or even Bitcoin, depending on the metrics you use. At these levels, institutional adoption alone isn't enough. Macroeconomic factors, liquidity shocks, and regulatory oversight become critical. Regulators would likely intervene, and banks themselves would be cautious about moving enormous sums through a single token. This is why understanding realistic adoption is key for investors. Despite these limitations, Ripple's technology does offer tangible advantages. ODL enables cross-border payments in seconds with near-zero fees, eliminating the need for pre-funded Nostro accounts. This can save banks substantial costs, which is why early adopters continue to experiment with the system. Ripple estimates that certain corridors could save up to 42% in transaction costs, a figure that is highly attractive to cost-conscious treasurers. However, the scale of these savings depends on how extensively XRP is used as the liquidity bridge. In many cases, banks may achieve efficiency gains without significantly impacting the token's market price. Another factor influencing demand is regulatory clarity. Ripple's legal victory against the SEC removed a major obstacle, but institutions still prefer predictable rules and minimal risk. Many global banks are already exploring central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, and stablecoins like USDC as alternatives for cross-border liquidity. These options provide similar benefits with clearer regulatory frameworks, making them attractive for risk-averse institutions. That's why XRP's growth potential is tied not only to technology adoption, but also to regulatory certainty and the overall competitive landscape. Community sentiment and hype cycles also continue to play a role. Social media narratives and bullish predictions can temporarily influence retail demand, creating short-term price surges. However, these are often detached from the real-world mechanics of bank adoption and liquidity usage. Understanding the difference between hype-driven price movements and fundamental demand is essential for making informed investment decisions. Retail investors should avoid basing their strategies solely on social media predictions, instead focusing on measurable adoption trends and realistic market scenarios. In summary, bank adoption of RippleNet is happening, but its effect on XRP's price is gradual and conditional. Only ODL directly increases demand for the token, and widespread, simultaneous adoption by multiple megabanks is required to create significant upward price pressure. Infrastructure improvements, cost savings, and legal clarity all support long-term growth, but extreme price predictions remain speculative without exponential adoption. Investors must consider both the utility of the technology and the liquidity mechanics before betting on dramatic price increases. Now that we've analyzed liquidity and bank adoption, it's time to look at XRP's competitive landscape. The world of cross-border payments is evolving rapidly. Ripple is not the only player, and understanding alternatives like stablecoins and central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, is critical for anyone thinking about XRP's potential. Banks are highly risk-averse, and they prefer solutions with regulatory clarity and minimal volatility. Stablecoins like USDC or USDT provide a predictable framework that many institutions trust. They offer fast, low-cost transfers without requiring banks to manage a volatile token like XRP. This is one reason why, even with Ripple's technology adoption, XRP's price may not immediately skyrocket. CBDCs are another important factor. Several central banks are launching digital currencies designed for cross-border settlement. These are fully backed by governments with legal certainty and regulatory support. For a bank treasurer, this is often safer than adopting a token that is still seen as somewhat experimental, even if it has technological advantages. XRP's growth depends not just on RippleNet adoption, but also on how banks weigh these alternative solutions. While ODL can reduce costs and speed up transfers, stablecoins and CBDCs provide predictability, compliance, and risk management, factors that often outweigh minor efficiency gains for large institutions. That said, Ripple has unique advantages. XRP as a liquidity bridge can dramatically reduce the need for pre-funding accounts and speed up settlements to a few seconds. This efficiency is highly appealing, especially for corridors where liquidity is tight. Early adopters like SBI Japan have seen tangible benefits, which could inspire other institutions to experiment. Yet, as we discussed, using XRP for liquidity is optional, not mandatory. Banks may continue to experiment with small volumes, pilot projects, or mixed solutions where XRP is used alongside stablecoins or fiat, limiting immediate token demand. Competition also affects price psychology. While retail investors may focus on bullish narratives or social media hype predicting $100 or $1,000 XRP, banks are looking at the broader landscape. Multiple solutions exist for efficient cross-border transfers, each with its own regulatory and operational advantages. Ripple's challenge is to make XRP indispensable, not just faster, but irreplaceable within a global network. Until then, speculation may drive short-term movements, but real institutional adoption and token demand will take time to materialize. Another aspect to consider is network effects. RippleNet's value increases as more institutions join. Even if initial adoption doesn't impact XRP price dramatically, growing network participation enhances long-term potential. This can eventually increase token demand as the system scales. However, the timeline for this is measured in years, not months. Investors should maintain realistic expectations and understand that adoption-driven price movements are gradual, not instantaneous. From a retail investor perspective, it's important to distinguish between narrative-driven hype and fundamental adoption. Community sentiment, social media discussions, and predictions like Barry C's tweet can influence short-term trading. But the real story of XRP's value growth is grounded in measurable factors: institutional adoption, liquidity usage, regulatory clarity, and competition over time. These factors will determine whether XRP can achieve moderate growth or, in extreme scenarios, approach the ambitious targets some analysts claim. In conclusion, XRP exists in a competitive financial ecosystem where multiple solutions offer similar benefits. Ripple's ODL system provides clear advantages in efficiency, cost savings, and speed, but adoption is gradual and optional for banks. Stablecoins and CBDCs are viable alternatives that reduce risk for institutions. For XRP to reach high valuations, it must become a critical, irreplaceable piece of the global payments puzzle. Retail investors should focus on adoption metrics, liquidity trends, and regulatory developments rather than social media hype. Now let's explore the role of narrative and hype cycles in XRP's price movements. In crypto, stories matter as much as numbers. Retail investors often react to social media predictions, tweets, and community sentiment before real adoption occurs. This is why you see extreme price targets being thrown around: $100, $500, even $1,000 per coin. On the surface, these claims sound outrageous given XRP's current price around $2.20, but narrative has a way of temporarily influencing markets even if the fundamentals aren't yet in place. For example, in 2017, Bitcoin's meteoric rise was fueled more by belief and FOMO than by actual technological adoption. The same principle applies to XRP. When influential voices, forums, and social media personalities highlight potential bank adoption, retail enthusiasm can spike, driving temporary price movements. Hype cycles act like oxygen for crypto. People see a story, they believe it, and they buy. It's psychology more than math. This is why you often see sharp upward swings followed by consolidation or pullbacks. Even though XRP adoption by banks is growing gradually, these hype cycles can create short-term opportunities for retail investors. However, relying solely on narrative without understanding liquidity, adoption mechanics, and regulatory factors is risky. The key takeaway is that narrative can amplify price movements, but it cannot replace real demand. Sustainable price growth comes from actual usage of XRP in financial transactions, network expansion, and long-term adoption by banks. Another aspect to consider is community-driven momentum. XRP has an active and vocal following, and platforms like Twitter, Reddit, and Discord amplify predictions and excitement. This collective sentiment can drive temporary price spikes, often disconnected from underlying adoption metrics. Retail investors sometimes confuse this momentum with real institutional commitment. Understanding this difference is crucial. Hype-driven rallies may provide trading opportunities, but they rarely sustain extreme valuations unless supported by fundamentals. That's why we always emphasize on BullionIQ the need to combine sentiment analysis with real adoption data and liquidity understanding. It's also important to examine past cycles for context. XRP has experienced surges driven by speculation, followed by periods of sideways consolidation or retracement. These movements illustrate how sentiment temporarily inflates price expectations. They also highlight the importance of patience and disciplined investing. Chasing extreme predictions can result in significant losses if fundamentals do not support the hype. Investors should set their own realistic targets based on adoption trends, liquidity metrics, and regulatory clarity rather than being swayed solely by social media excitement. Regulatory developments continue to interact with narrative as well. Positive legal outcomes like Ripple's win against the SEC can fuel optimism, while uncertainty or negative news can quickly dampen enthusiasm. Hype cycles are therefore closely intertwined with market perception of risk and reward. Retail traders often overestimate the impact of positive sentiment without considering long-term structural limitations such as token supply, liquidity needs, and alternative solutions like stablecoins or CBDCs. Understanding this balance between narrative and fundamentals is key to navigating XRP's price movements safely. In addition, extreme price predictions act as psychological anchors for retail investors. Tweets claiming XRP will reach $500 or $1,000 serve more as motivational markers than realistic forecasts. They inspire hope and encourage engagement, but rarely reflect achievable short-term targets. Investors who anchor their strategies solely on these predictions risk misalignment between expectations and reality. By contrast, those who focus on actual adoption data, liquidity trends, and market depth are better positioned to make informed decisions. In summary, narrative and hype cycles play a powerful role in influencing XRP's short-term price, but they cannot replace adoption-driven fundamentals. Temporary spikes driven by social media, FOMO, and community sentiment are real. But sustainable long-term growth relies on measurable factors: bank adoption, liquidity usage, regulatory clarity, and competitive positioning. Retail investors should leverage hype awareness for tactical decisions, but maintain a strategic focus on fundamentals. In Part 6, we will conclude by summarizing key takeaways, actionable advice for investors, and the realistic long-term outlook for XRP, including risk management strategies for navigating the volatile crypto market. Now, it's time to wrap up everything we've discussed and give a realistic long-term outlook for XRP. After analyzing liquidity mechanics, bank adoption competition, and narrative-driven hype, it's clear that XRP has potential, but extreme price predictions like $500 or $1,000 per coin remain highly speculative. The token's growth depends on multiple factors working together: adoption by financial institutions, sustainable demand for XRP as a liquidity bridge, regulatory clarity, and competitive positioning relative to stablecoins and CBDCs. Investors should approach XRP with a balanced perspective, understanding both the opportunities and the limitations of the market. First, adoption matters. RippleNet is expanding, and banks like SBI Japan and institutions using ODL are proof that the technology works. These early adopters show the efficiency, speed, and cost-saving benefits of using XRP for cross-border payments. But widespread adoption is a slow process. Banks test new technology cautiously, often running pilot programs before committing to full-scale implementation. Even if more banks join the network, the impact on XRP's price will be gradual unless the token is actively used for liquidity in large volumes. This means retail investors must differentiate between technology adoption and token demand. Adoption of RippleNet does not automatically equal a price surge. Second, liquidity is critical. XRP's total supply is large, and only a fraction is in circulation. For prices to increase dramatically, large amounts of XRP would need to be used consistently in cross-border settlements. Right now, the market is not yet at a stage where trillions of dollars flow through XRP daily. Without that scale, even extreme hype cannot produce sustainable four-digit prices. This is why understanding liquidity metrics and market depth is essential before making investment decisions. Third, competition and regulatory factors cannot be ignored. Stablecoins like USDC and emerging CBDCs offer predictable, regulated alternatives for banks seeking cross-border solutions. XRP's advantage is speed and cost efficiency, but it must compete with safer options that minimize institutional risk. Regulatory clarity, like Ripple's SEC case resolution, is helpful, but institutions still demand legal certainty and predictable frameworks. Investors need to factor these realities into their expectations. Fourth, hype cycles and community sentiment influence short-term movements. Tweets, social media, and predictions can temporarily inflate prices, but these fluctuations are often detached from actual adoption. Optimism and fear of missing out may create short-term trading opportunities, but sustainable, long-term growth is rooted in fundamentals. Retail investors should be cautious not to anchor strategies solely on social media hype and extreme predictions. Finally, diversification and risk management are essential. Crypto is inherently volatile. Even with promising adoption trends, unexpected regulatory changes, market shocks, or competition can affect XRP's price. Dollar cost averaging, setting realistic price targets, and avoiding overexposure to a single token are key strategies to manage risk. Investors control their own strategy, not social media predictions, and should align their approach with their personal risk tolerance and long-term goals. In conclusion, XRP is a strong technology with real-world utility, but extreme price predictions should be treated as motivational rather than guaranteed outcomes. Gradual adoption, liquidity growth, and regulatory clarity will ultimately determine the token's sustainable value. Retail investors can benefit by focusing on fundamentals, tracking real adoption data, understanding liquidity mechanics, and using hype awareness for tactical decisions without letting it dictate strategy.
XRP may achieve significant growth, but patience, research, and disciplined investing are crucial.
Here at BullionIQ, we aim to cut through the noise, present facts, and provide clear analysis for investors of all levels. Remember, crypto is brutal, brilliant, and never boring. By staying informed, managing risk, and keeping perspective, you can navigate the XRP journey with confidence. Whether the token rises moderately or experiences dramatic spikes, understanding the mechanics behind the hype ensures you make smarter, more calculated decisions. Stick to your plan, track adoption trends, and stay disciplined. That's how real crypto investors separate dreams from reality.